What is the deal with the Great Migration, and why is it so significant? The biggest aspect of this migration was the long-lasting effects the shift had on American society the next 50 years, up to the present day. But how did the migration begin? No one knows how it started or who took the first step. The earliest reference we have to the Great Migration is from the Chicago Defender on February 5, 1916. On this date, the Chicago Defender ran a story with a photo showing several hundred black families leaving for the North. When an interviewer asked one of the migrants why they were leaving, they responded that their conditions didn't warrant staying. What were these conditions? After the Civil War, economically, blacks were no better off. Sharecropping kept slaves in debt and bound them to plantations. They could exercise their rights that they were guaranteed by the federal government, but only while the federal government forced the laws. Essentially, slaves were still stuck in a feudal caste system, working off the land like a serf. Why didn't the newly freed slaves leave directly after the Civil War? Well, there was no compensation or land given to the slaves, so black Southerners had no capital, no land, or education. There simply was no way for black Southerners to get on their feet and begin their lives. While a lack of land and incentives all seem like reasons for people to leave, we must also consider the people who are being asked to leave. They were agricultural people. It was hard for them to break away from their roots. On top of this, there were no contacts in the North. There were no ways for African Americans to find their way north with a degree of certainty and safety. On top of this, the North had Europe to provide labor for their factories. Blacks weren't guaranteed jobs if they were moving north, especially if Europeans were undercutting the market. Another possible reason for blacks not moving north would be the resolve of African Americans to try to scratch out a living in the South for themselves. So based on this information, we know that nobody started the migration, and the conditions of black Southerners encouraged the migration. Despite the poor conditions that seemed universal in the South, there was no one leader who united African Americans in migrating north, though. In fact, most prominent black leaders were not in favor of the migration. Booker T. Washington, for example, was against it. So, no one person truly started it, but we know what started the Great Migration. Truthfully, it was desire to move forward. African Americans had to make a decision. They had to choose to stay calm and face the oppression of the South, or move north to begin again. For many, making this choice was difficult. However, there were some essential reasons to go. The scope for African American economic, educational, and political activity were far greater in the North and the West. Southern migrants would leave at the expense of their health, moving towards poorer living conditions, but they would leave hoping they would find more opportunities for advancement in the North and West. Also keep in mind the context of the South. In 1894, Plessy v. Ferguson was decided by the Supreme Court. This case determined that separate but equal accommodations were constitutional, and the Supreme Court sided with the South. After this case, government regulations would segregate public transportation. However, segregation would not stop there. It would go on to influence seemingly every fabric of Southern life. On top of segregation, there was also the issue of blatant racism. Lynching was a continual problem from the 1920s through the 30s and beyond. Blacks could often be lynched over petty charges, such as an, quote, insult to a white person, over which more than 60 blacks were lynched. While all these elements contributed to why African Americans left the South, the event that was the catalyst for moving north was World War I. In the 1910s, 550,000 workers left the South. In comparison, from 1900 to 1910, 194,000 workers left the South. Clearly, African Americans were ready to leave. The significance of this war and migration north cannot be understated. The labor crisis in the North arose from a lack of workers due to the war and this labor market being hindered in Europe. There were no Europeans coming to fill the jobs that they had been filling previously, so the North had to look elsewhere for a cheap labor supply.
America's Georgia. 50 members of the race were arrested last week when they attempted to leave for cities in the north and east. The arrested men were brought back and held, pending investigation and legal actions to stop the wholesale migration of Negro workers. Chicago Defender.
Why does the Negro leave the South? Indeed, you would feel a large part of the answer if you could be on this train, in this Jim Crow car, and share for one night the longing of these people to reach the line that divides Dixie from the rest of creation.
As soon as I got on that train, I felt free. Sure, I was sitting in the Jim Crow section up front where all the coal and dust rose up, got in the windows and ruined my clothes. But the chugging of the train couldn't hardly keep up with the beating in my heart.
Just behind us is a car for white people, where they can stretch out and rest their heads. They have paid exactly the same fares as we have. Some of these colored men are in the service of the United States, summoned from the far corners of Texas to fight for democracy in Europe. This is certainly a good preparation for trench warfare.
We were hoping we'd see the Mason-Dixon line. I thought it would look like a line of trees with some kind of white mark in the middle. Then someone said the bridge ahead was it. We were north now.
If life in the cities was a more appealing option for Black Southern migrants, they would soon discover that the effects of white nationalism had created harsh realities not only in the South, but in the northern cities as well. While there were new opportunities for work, the wages were dismal, and there was little to no guarantee that their jobs would be there the next day. And where the wages were decent, the work was often dangerous and arduous. One company that demonstrated this brand of selective hiring was the Ford Motor Company. They would give blacks decent wages, not far off from whites, but records indicate they placed blacks on the hardest jobs like metal foundry. But even though blacks provided hard labor at a cheaper price, it became an all too familiar theme during the Great Depression and after for black workers to be the first laid off and the last to be hired back on. After a long, hard day of work, they would go home to cheap housing projects where they were charged 50 to 65% more for rent than their white counterparts. Somewhere between a quarter to half of their income was spent on rent alone. Sickness and poverty in these communities became rampant. Infant mortality rates were greater than those who stayed in the South, and there was a stark rise in venereal disease due to a lack of medical attention, and most households could hardly afford necessities. Because of these factors, kinship played a vital role in where Black Southerners would choose to move during the Great Migration. Black churches, social organizations like the NAACP, and work unions began to be arenas where there was a felt sense of community. Households often welcomed anyone from the community, which created a familial atmosphere not unlike what they would have experienced back home in the South. As black migrators flocked to the city, whites moved away and formed suburbanized areas that effectively segregated them from these black communities. For every one black person that moved into the inner city, 2 whites left. This movement, called the White Flight, created drastic economic restructuring where the political focus centered around these white suburban communities rather than the inner city.
The sudden migration of thousands from the south to the north naturally meant a transfer of culture and a blending of worlds. This was due largely to the sudden influx of African Americans in urban cities like Chicago or New York. Those who were typically accustomed to the quiet and pastoral South were suddenly confronted with bustling cities. However, the isolation and discrimination of the South, which led so many African Americans to migrate, were not entirely left behind when they traveled north. Black citizens were forced to segregate under Jim Crow laws. Though these cities were divided by ignorance and hate, black men and women still found community and solace in black spaces. Out of black neighborhoods came jazz, a form of music which helped to propel black expression. Fish fries and lawn parties created cultural hubs and helped to circulate money within black communities, even while these establishments were often white-owned. Jazz also served to unite black communities across different areas by sparking the rise of grassroots networking, through which musicians worked together to find employment for new migrants entering the cities. As jazz grew in popularity in Chicago during the Great Migration, grassroots networks reached all the way back to the South. These networks would often find employment for new migrants, help cover train fare, and even find new homes for individuals and families. Jazz and blues became a sort of voice for the oppressed, ringing deeply with themes of the black experience. However, the art form's popularity increased quickly and eventually spread to white communities as well. Many musicians worked in black and tan clubs, which welcomed both black and white patronage. Though many white customers still saw the clubs as lowbrow entertainment, these establishments helped to break the taboo of interracial society. This break came about slowly, however. Black and tan clubs and other dance clubs, which facilitated provocative behavior such as drinking and especially public dancing, were called devil's dance dens by evangelicals. Black dance styles, which were created and accompanied by jazz or blues, were considered demonstrative of a sinful lifestyle. These dances were critiqued in private church services, as well as over the radio and by word of mouth in white communities. The denunciation did not stop at dance halls. Jazz, especially because of its roots in black culture, was widely associated with promiscuity and immorality. Actually, the evangelical distaste for jazz began before the Great Migration in the conservative South. Evangelicals referred to jazz as the devil's music. From this tradition, as jazz rose as a symbol of rebellion, came the blues devil. This depiction of the devil was said to offer fame to musicians in exchange for their souls. The blues devil first appeared in jazz songs to parody hellfire preachers. Later, the blues devil represented pimps or white men who would pay for sex with black women who had recently migrated north. After this depiction became more popular, female artists started using jazz as a means of expressing their sexuality, regaining an agency which had been previously taken by men. However, these female artists were often disparaged by the church, which generalized any sexual content as inherently sinful. The need for agency and expression was especially important for black women. After emancipation, the value of black flesh was often debated, as black slaves were previously valued for their ability to labor for white masters. Since then, black women were commonly valued only for their sexuality, though they were also shamed for it. Jazz, dance, and even drinking in clubs became ways for black women to reclaim their identity and display control over their own lives, even at the risk of condemnation. Themes of racial identity and self-expression were especially important in black literature. Artists such as Langston Hughes tried to capture the black experience as well as define black identity. However, blackness ran deeper than just race, connecting to cultural identity, economics, gender, and class. In Spanish Blood, Hughes explores what truly defines race and consequently what defines blackness. As Hughes was raised in Mexico, his identity was rooted heavily in Central American culture, in addition to African American culture. For this reason, Hughes often challenged the misconception that race was a dichotomy. The new Negro Renaissance helped move away from conventional understanding of race and open up avenues for black artists to share their stories. Writers in this movement often depicted mixed-race characters trying to define their identity. Mixed characters have since become predictable stock characters in American fiction, especially in passing novels. Nella Larson and Jessie Redmond Fawcett are important figures in the tradition with their novels Passing and Plum Bun, both of which follow a light-skinned woman who is able to pass for white. Passing was especially important to women at the time, whose place in society hinged more on their ability to exist in white spaces. The definition of blackness becomes more complex and individualized as characters discover the power to move between black and white communities freely. However, as mixed characters participate in white communities, called crossing, they are forced to perform and suppress their black identity. All these facets of the black experience became important subjects of visual art during the Great Migration. The most important artist of the time was Jacob Lawrence, who created 60 paintings depicting the Great Migration. Lawrence was deeply involved in the politics and movements that affected African Americans, working with figures such as Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and John Brown. Because his parents were both from the South, he was close to the previous tradition of artists depicting pastoral life, which often included black slaves. His own art uses a similar, simple style. However, the minimalism and cubism still portray intense themes of pain and injustice. The series is often regarded as a story which dramatizes the shared experience of black migrants. The painting focuses on everyday scenes such as taking the train, doing housework, or working in a city office. Be it through music, literature, paintings, or even the furious fight for civil rights, the Great Migration normalized and radicalized the inclusion of black voices in American culture. The power of the Great Migration awarded to the black community can still be seen today, though more work still needs to be done.
City. By the 1960s, conditions began to worsen due to a myriad of factors. There was rapid deindustrialization, which resulted in lost jobs, and racial discrimination had stayed prominent, in some cases even more exaggerated. This led to unprecedented amounts of riots and gang violence. Incarceration rates of blacks mushroomed in the North while migration rates grew. Delinquency amongst black youth became an ongoing issue. A study performed by the University of Chicago Sociology Department reveals that delinquency is an inevitable part of social assimilation in cities, and that immigrant children usually demonstrate more delinquent behavior than their parents. Such was the case in cities like Chicago, and as first-generation migrators gave way to the second generation, cities began to see the fallout that was triggered by oppressive social forces. One specific way that it manifested itself was in fierce gang violence. Black gangs had existed before, but by the late 50s and 60s, black communities in cities like Chicago began to experience a surge in gang-related activity. Consequently, there began to be a disconnect between the black youth and the original migrators. It was partially due to these dire circumstances that black communities began to come together more than ever before, especially those who participated in the church and other social organizations. There began to grow a movement that all black communities felt they could get behind, the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement provided an outlet for many of the frustrations that black communities felt, and the first real opportunity to have a communal voice in the United States. Activists such as Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Rosa Parks were finally giving voice to the voiceless and were leaders that black communities could rally behind.
Throughout history, the segregated neighborhoods that Southern blacks flocked to often became the ground centers of massive, racially motivated rioting. In most cases, the protesting began in response to perceived unfair treatment of the black community. This is a trend that continues today, as seen in modern violent protests in Baltimore, Ferguson, and Milwaukee. By the end of the second migration, an estimated 5 to 8 million blacks had resettled outside of the South. Moving ahead to the 1960s, the Civil Rights Movement had introduced a new vision of racial identity in America. This movement's leaders argued for the equality of all people. Meanwhile, the definition of all people was changing. Changes in immigration policy starting in 1952 started a new era of skills-based multicultural immigration. This includes African migrants adding a new black perspective to the American story. By the 1990s, a new multicultural American identity had emerged. During this period, the rise of the black middle class was evident.
You know, we're used to thinking about white flight to the suburbs and black segregation, black concentration in cities.
That's the voice of William Fry. He's been tracking the shifting demographics of America over the past 5 decades.
To some degree that still exists, but there's also been a noticeable movement of blacks to the suburbs, and it's fairly pervasive. It's not just in 2 or 3 cities, but it's in a lot of cities across the country. Northern cities, southern cities, western cities. African Americans started to make this move, especially in the last 20 or 25 years. Really large numbers of blacks moved to the South. I attribute some of it to younger generations, several generations since the civil rights laws were enacted in the 1960s, who now do have an opportunity to get advanced educations, at least some college. And, you know, getting that foothold into the middle class, I think, is an important part of what's going on.
Today, the geography established by the Great Migration is beginning to fade away. Southern states have been leaders in black population growth since the 1970s. Still, these states have only captured a 4% increase in the share of the black population over the last 4 decades. So while we are seeing a reversal of the trend of African American migration to cities, it's unlikely the movement will be as far-reaching as the great migrations of the past. And it's because this migration is about a search for agency and opportunity, not about fleeing from violence.
The stakes are not the same now as they would have been during the Great Migration. You know, they are quite different in character and in magnitude. Many of them were fleeing like refugees with no certainty as to what was going to happen to them or how they would make a go of it in this new age.
The Civil Rights Movement largely halted migratory movements to the North. Instead, former black Southerners began to return home to the South, effectively ending what we now know as the Great Migration. Today, we see the impact that pre-civil rights era economic restructuring had on urbanized communities. Black families are leaving the city at rates unimagined years ago in order to escape from the dismal conditions of the inner city. Instead, they're moving back south or to more suburban neighborhoods. Cities like New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C. have taken steps forward with a focus on inner-city housing projects, but the neglect that past government officials demonstrated still leaves a blot on their tenures. Even with the improvements, it's become commonplace for the grandsons and granddaughters of the migrators to want out of the quote-unquote projects.